I wish we could. This is a critical mission of the United States government. It's clearly within the constitutional responsibility. I personally wish we could appropriate more dollars, but we live within a tough budgetary time, and so I think we need to make best use out of the dollars that we have and make it more efficient. And I think that's part of what these hearings are going to be all about. One thing, Mr. Marr, you mentioned is that implementing this strategic plan that risk is not taken into account, I guess, as much as it should. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. In our September 2011 report that we issued on the QHSR, we talked about risk in sort of two different ways. First, in developing the QHSR, the department started going down the road of developing a national risk assessment, sort of pulling up at the national level, what are the risks to Homeland Security, and trying to build that into the overall analysis. They developed a methodology, but they didn't have the full analytic framework in place in time to complete that for this current QHSR. So in our report, we recommended that they do it for the next QHSR, and our understanding is that the DHS has actions in place to do that. The second aspect of risk that we looked at was in the department's decisions about which of these Burr initiatives to prioritize. These were key initiatives coming out of the bottom-up review. What were the things that the DHS really wanted to focus on as a priority? There were a number of things that went into that equation, but there was not a formal risk assessment that was part of determining what things sort of floated to the top. And part of that reason was because some of these Burr initiatives weren't really apples-to-apples comparisons. They ranged from very large things like aviation security to more focused, narrow things like improving the capabilities of canines who can detect explosives. So again, we recommended that DHS take this into account in the next iteration of the QHSR, and they said that they would do so.
And do you believe that would make DHS a more efficient agency?
Absolutely. We think risk is one of several inputs into these kind of strategic decisions, but certainly that's what DHS is in the business of doing, protecting the Homeland Security, and risk needs to be part of that equation.
Mr. Cohn, are you willing to, in the next, I guess this strategic plan will come out again this next year, is that correct?
So the strategic plan will be released with the President's fiscal year 13 budget, so on or about February 13th. But we agreed with the recommendations of the Government Accountability Office and are planning to incorporate both elements into the next QHSR, which we'll conduct in calendar year 13. If I could just add to what Mr. Moore said, in terms of the overall strategic national risk assessment, we recognized in the QHSR, in the terms of reference, that the Department did not have a methodology to conduct that. And one of the things we did in the first QHSR was charter a working group to determine how we would go about approaching that problem. That working group reported its results, and part of that methodology was actually used to develop the strategic national risk assessment that informed our preparedness efforts that Dr. Caudill referenced. For the next quadrennial review, we are planning to do a full assessment of the Homeland Security environment to include the current strategic environment, future strategic environment, threat landscape, strategic national risk assessment for a full scope look. In addition, in terms of the Burr initiatives, the challenge that we had was the Department did not have an overall mechanism for doing, as Mr. Moore noted, an apples-to-apples comparison of dissimilar activities across missions and across organizations. Certainly, most of our organizations use robust risk assessment processes in determining the thrust of their activities. The challenge has been for the Department in figuring out a holistic way to use risk at the capability, program, or activity level to look not only within organizations, but across organizations, across missions and portfolios.
Well, I look forward to seeing that, and I'm glad that you're taking Mr. Marr's advice in his recommendations. We heard testimony from Mr. Schneider, who has an interesting background both in the DoD and in DHS, has a lot of experience in management. What is probably, Mr. Cohn, you'd probably be the best, and maybe perhaps Mr. Marr as well. What's your response to his idea of looking at kind of a DoD model, that this Goldwater-Nichols approach?
So it's interesting. I think that Deputy Secretary Schneider, both in his remarks and his written testimony, point out the timeline that DoD worked on to reach the point of integration that it's at. created in 1947. 9 years into the Department of Defense was 1956, and the Department of Defense struggled with a lot of the same issues that have been pointed out here. In the early 1960s, Secretary Robert McNamara implemented the planning, programming, and budgeting process in DoD, which was really an effort to get the department to look holistically across its organizations at its nationally oriented programs from a mission perspective. It was not until 1986 with Goldwater-Nichols and 1989 with the Defense Management Review that you got to that heightened level of operational integration. What the department is really focused on right now is focusing on getting to that first step of being able to look at our investment processes from an integrated perspective across our Secretary and Deputy Secretary, the heads of our directorates, our components, looking at making sure we have cross-departmental perspectives and decisions on strategy and policy, on requirements, programming and budgeting, and on acquisition oversight. And that's a lot of the work that the Management Directorate is doing, and that they're working in concert with the
My time is I'd like to follow up with that. I think it's an interesting idea. You know, whether it's workable, I think, you know, Mr. Keeney, I can discuss that, but it's certainly an interesting idea to take a look at. Mr. Marr, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely an interesting idea to look at, and I think conceptually it makes sense to try to do whatever you can to try to break down some of the stovepipes across the various operational components with DHS. And the department is doing some things to go down that road. They've, for example, recently consolidated their process for developing an SES class. They used to have 4 separate processes. Now it's just one for the whole department. One of the Burr initiatives is looking at how the different components are having a regional presence and trying to consolidate that across the department as well. I think there are definitely some lessons learned from Goldwater-Nichols that could be applied to DHS, and it'd be something interesting to follow in the coming years.
I would like to follow up with Mr. Schneider, and perhaps Mr. Cohen, you and I can discuss that more. One last question. I see my time's expired, but Mr. Reese, you mentioned an interesting fact that I was not aware of. And how many agencies outside of DHS have a Homeland Security mission?
The federal department, there's a total of 19 just based on research that's been done, and that's including Department of Homeland Security. The CRS, Homeland Security Department, FY12 appropriations has a table in the back that I'll be happy to provide to the staff that breaks down funding. DHS gets 51.7% of the funding, and then the rest is broken down in those other agencies, with Department of Defense being second at approximately 26%.
I'd like to see those agencies, because what you're telling me is Homeland Security Department, which has the primary mission of defending the nation and the homeland, essentially gets 51% of the funding for the mission.
Yes, sir.
That's a very interesting fact. I'd like to follow up with you on that.